The year 2026. It really arrived with two geopolitical shocks, didn't it?
It certainly did. Not a quiet start to the year.
We're watching two massive crises unfold at the same time. On one hand, you have this sudden, really dramatic military intervention in Venezuela,
Mm,
and on the other, there's this simmering strategic confrontation over Greenland, the massive ice-covered island.
right. And at first glance, they seem completely unrelated.
Exactly. But they're not just about foreign policy or, some remote geography. They're exposing this deep historic fault line right inside American governance itself.
And that fault line is the struggle over the authority to make war.
Mm,
I mean, who ultimately gets to decide when the United States commits its blood and treasure?
that's the question.
Our sources today, and we have a dense stack of them, legal analyses, constitutional history, strategy papers, they all make it clear that this isn't a new fight. It's a generational struggle, and it feels like it's coming to a head right now.
So our mission today is to cut through all that noise and really give you the full picture of this incredibly volatile moment. We've synthesized everything, drawing really heavily from articles that detail the U.S. Senate's immediate challenge to executive power.
That's the resolution, SJ 3.98.
Right. And we're going to dive into the historical foundation of that challenge, the 1973 War Powers Resolution.
But you can't understand this in a vacuum. You just can't. Because these executive actions, these tests of war powers, they're happening against a backdrop of really rapid global change.
The Arctic.
The Arctic. So we are going deep into its accelerating militarization. We're going to look at Russia's fortification strategy, China's Polar Silk Road ambition, and the growing, very pragmatic alliance between them.
And crucially, we have to look at the perspective that's so often ignored.
The indigenous perspective from Greenland. The actual people whose sovereignty is at the heart of this whole thing.
This deep dive is really for anyone who understands that the future of NATO, the stability of international law, and, the constitutional guardrails of American democracy are all on the line.
Climate change is literally redrawing the map. And we need to understand how quickly power politics is adapting to that new reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the most immediate flashpoint, that military action in Venezuela.
So we have to begin with the headline that just dominated the start of the year. The operation in Venezuela.
The capture of former President Nicolás Maduro.
It marks one of the most assertive and, frankly, unilateral U.S. military actions we have seen in decades. It was swift, it was decisive, and it carried profound implications.
And what immediately sent alarm bells ringing all over Washington, it wasn't just the capture itself, was it? It was the statement that came right after.
Exactly. The sources all highlight this. The U.S. asserted administrative control over Venezuela.
It specified that this control would be maintained
For an indefinite period.
that wording, indefinite period. It's so crucial because it's a commitment without any clear exit ramp.
It's more than just a lack of an exit ramp. It's an open-ended assertion of military governance. And critics, they immediately labeled this not as just a foreign policy choice, but as a fundamental constitutional rupture.
A rupture? How so?
Well, think about the sequence. The president initiated a major hostile action. He committed U.S. forces, and then he claimed enduring authority over a foreign country, all without seeking any congressional authorization.
He acted first.
He acted first, and he presented Congress with a fait accompli war that had already started, and basically dared them to try and stop him.
That is the textbook definition of a challenge to Article 1 of the Constitution, which, it clearly gives Congress the power to declare war.
Yep.
The president is the commander-in-chief, sure, but Congress is the one that's supposed to initiate war.
Right. The speed and the scale of this Venezuelan operation just made that erosion of congressional power impossible for anyone to ignore.
Which is precisely why Congress felt they had to push back and push back immediately.
Exactly. With specific institutional pushback. And that came in the form of this joint resolution, SJ 98.
Okay, let's get into the details of SJRS 98, because this isn't just like a critical press release. It's designed to have real legal teeth.
It is. This resolution, it was introduced by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, and it was co-sponsored by senior Democratic leaders, Schumer, Adam Schiff. But its focus is what's key here. It is laser-focused.
On what, specifically?
Its explicit sole purpose is to halt any further unauthorized U.S. military operations within or against Venezuela. It demands the termination of this military involvement. It's Congress trying to slam on the brakes where the executive only saw a green light.
What really stands out to me in the sources is just the raw political symbolism of that first procedural vote. It advanced on a razor-thin margin, 52 to 47, but the alignment on that vote was staggering.
Oh, it was anything but a purely partisan affair.
Far from it.
That procedural victory, it required a crucial group of Republicans to break ranks with their own party's president.
And we're talking about some big names.
Big names and a really diverse group ideologically. You have Senators Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Todd Young, and Josh Hawley.
So you have a libertarian skeptic like Paul, moderates and institutionalists like Collins and Murkowski, and then, an assertive national conservative like Hawley.
Right. And seeing them all aligned with the Democratic leadership on this one issue tells you something really important.
What's that?
The core issue for them isn't the policy goal in Venezuela. It's the process.
It's about who gets to decide.
Exactly. It completely transforms the fight from just another partisan squabble into a genuine institutional clash. They weren't necessarily voting against intervening in Venezuela. They were voting for the integrity of their own constitutional powers under Article 1.
That is the whole crux of it, isn't it? I mean, when a senator like Hawley, who is usually very supportive of an assertive foreign policy, when he defects, that's a signal of profound institutional alarm.
It is. They're afraid of this steady, generation-long erosion of Congress's role in authorizing force. They recognize that if the executive can unilaterally start and sustain a war in Venezuela, well, the precedent is set. He can do it anywhere.
And that would basically render Congress obsolete on the most serious decision a state can make.
Precisely.
So let's get into the weeds of the legal mechanism here. What is the tool that this resolution actually invokes?
This is the legislative hammer.
Yeah?
SJRE's .98 invokes Section 5C of the 1973 War Powers Resolution.
The WPR.
The WPR. This specific section is the statutory instrument that was designed to force the withdrawal of U.S. forces from an ongoing conflict if Congress believes the executive is operating without proper authorization.
So invoking 5C is a formal challenge. It's not just a debate.
It's a formal legislative challenge that forces a timeline and a direct accountable vote on whether the conflict should continue.
And Senator Kaine was really clear about the intent, wasn't he? He connected it directly back to the framers' vision.
He was very clear. He emphasized that the resolution is purely about process. It's about forcing the public accountable debate that the Constitution requires, and that, in this case, the president just bypassed.
So it's about restoring the system of accountability.
His whole position was that the U.S. Constitution demands the legislative branch collectively own the decision to start a war. The president's actions circumvented that. The resolution is an attempt to restore the friction that the founders intentionally designed into the system.
Restoring friction. I like that phrasing. But the sources also remind us that even though this is a huge step, the resolution faces, and I'm quoting here, steep odds of actually succeeding.
The legislative path is punishing, a real gauntlet.
What does that gauntlet look like?
Okay, so first, SJRE's 98 needs to pass a full Senate vote. That seems likely given the procedural vote, but you never know.
Okay.
Then comes the really hard part. It has to clear a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. And even with those 5 key Senate Republicans on board, the political calculation in the House is much, much tougher.
Why is that?
House leadership might be far less willing to challenge the president, especially on a foreign policy action that's being framed as a success.
And even if it somehow clears both chambers, there's still the threat of a presidential veto.
A veto is almost a certainty. The president has made it clear he views these kinds of resolutions as an infringement on his Article 2 powers. And to override that veto, SJRE's 98 would need a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House.
Which is historically almost impossible to achieve.
It's extremely difficult, especially when you're going up against an incumbent executive who can rally his base around national security. So yes, it's a powerful statement, but its practical effect, its ability to actually force a withdrawal, remains very uncertain.
So SJRE's 98 is this huge, significant constitutional challenge, but it might not actually stop the operation in Venezuela. This whole confrontation forces us to look backward, doesn't it?
It does.
We have to go back to the original battlefield where this whole fight started, the War Powers Resolution of 1973.
If you want to connect this fight in 2026 to its deep history, you have to start with what the framers intended. They didn't just accidentally divide war powers, they did it very deliberately.
Let's define that constitutional fault line. What was the intentional division, and what was the thinking behind it?
The division came from a really deep suspicion of unchecked executive authority, especially when it came to war and peace. So you have Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the power to declare war, to raise armies, to fund them, and to regulate them.
That ensures deliberation. A consensus has to be built before you commit.
Right. Then you have Article 2, which designates the president as commander-in-chief, the tactical and strategic leader of the forces once they're committed.
So it's a balance.
It's a balance. The framers wanted, energy and execution for swift command, but restraint in initiation to prevent the nation from stumbling into wars based on the whims of one person.
But that balance, it just fractured completely during the 20th century. After World War II, the power of the president just accelerated, creating what the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. famously called the imperial presidency.
The Cold War changed everything. I mean, the whole structural reality of American power shifted. We went from fighting occasional, formally declared wars to this state of permanent global readiness.
With alliances all over the world and a constant nuclear threat.
Right, and that perpetual state of crisis naturally funneled power toward the executive. Presidents had access to instant intelligence. They could deploy forces anywhere on the globe by executive order, completely bypassing the slow, deliberate process of Congress.
And the Korean War, that was really the first major step in eroding that article of power, wasn't it?
It was critical precedent. It institutionalized presidential war-making. In 1950, President Truman committed U.S. forces to a massive war in Korea. He never went to Congress for a formal declaration.
So what was his justification?
He relied on UN Security Council resolutions, and, crucially, he framed the whole thing as a police action.
A police action.
That little semantic trick allowed the executive to basically redefine a major sustained conflict as something less than war. And in doing so, he circumvented Congress's authority to declare it.
And that set the stage for the ultimate breaking point.
Vietnam.
Which was just this long, drawn-out case study in incremental executive escalation.
Vietnam was a slow-motion constitutional catastrophe. The escalation was gradual, and it was fueled initially by the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
The blank check.
The blank check, as many lawmakers later admitted. Congress passed it in response to some alleged naval attacks, but its language was so vague, so expansive, that it basically gave Presidents Johnson and Nixon a free pass to do whatever they wanted in Southeast Asia without any more authorization or oversight.
And then came the final betrayal of trust under Nixon.
The secret operations.
The secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos.
When those revelations came out, it just completely shattered the equilibrium. Nixon had authorized and carried out these extensive bombing campaigns, expanding the war into neutral countries without telling Congress, without consulting them, without getting any authorization.
So he was waging secret wars.
Exactly. And that confirmed the deepest fears of lawmakers, that the executive was now operating completely outside the constitutional framework. And that betrayal, combined with the whole atmosphere of Watergate, it just solidified the need for major reform.
So Congress finally decided to fight back. Who were the key figures who actually wrote the War Powers Resolution?
It was a truly bipartisan effort, which is important to remember. It was driven by institutional concern. The key architects were Senator Jacob Javits, a Republican from New York, and Representative Clement Zablocki, a Democrat from Wisconsin.
It moved quickly, right?
It moved with incredible urgency. It was introduced in May 1973 and passed both chambers by October. That shows you the kind of unified purpose they had.
But President Nixon tried to kill it immediately. What was his argument when he vetoed the bill?
On October 24, 1973, he issued this powerful veto message. He argued that the resolution was, and this is a direct quote, unconstitutional and dangerous.
Dangerous in what way?
His legal argument was twofold. First, he said it intruded on his role as commander-in-chief, that it tied his hands and would prevent swift responses to crises. And second, he argued that the constraints, especially the 60-day deadline, were just Congress trying to micromanage military operations, which he believed was a core executive function under Article 2.
But this was one of those rare moments where Congress actually had the political capital and the will to defy a president on national security.
They did. On November 7, 1973, they overrode his veto with powerful bipartisan majorities in both the House and the Senate. It was a historic moment. And it really only happened because of the deep institutional wounds from Vietnam and, frankly, the political weakness of Nixon because of Watergate.
They seized the opportunity.
They seized that narrow window to try and reclaim their constitutional mandate.
Okay, so let's get to the core of the law itself, the architecture of restraint. What are the three procedural guardrails that the WPR put in place?
These three parts are Congress's attempt to, as we said, restore friction to the system. The first is consultation. Section 3.
What does that mean, consultation?
It mandates that the president has to consult with Congress in every possible instance before introducing U.S. forces into hostilities. It's not just a polite phone call after the fact. It's designed to force a meaningful conversation before the action.
Giving Congress a chance to object or ask questions.
Exactly. The second part is the accountability piece, the famous 48-hour deadline.
The reporting requirement.
Right, Section 4A. Within 48 hours of committing forces, the president has to submit a written report to Congress. And this report has to be comprehensive. It has to detail the circumstances, the legal authority the president thinks he's using, and the estimated scope and duration of the mission.
So that officially notifies Congress and starts the clock.
It starts the clock. And that brings us to the third part, the legislative hammer that SJRE's 98 is trying to swing today, the 60-day clock.
Section 5B, this is the enforcement mechanism.
It is. If there's no formal declaration of war from Congress or no specific authorization for the continued use of military force and AUMF, then U.S. forces have to be withdrawn within 60 calendar days.
A hard limit.
It's a hard limit. There's a potential 30-day extension, but only for the safe disengagement of troops. So the absolute maximum is 90 days without congressional sign-off. The message is clear. Wars cannot just continue on executive inertia. Congress has to actively authorize them.
That all seems pretty definitive on paper, and yet the sources make it very clear that for the last 50 years, presidents from both parties have consistently resisted this law.
They have. The WPR is under constant executive challenge. And one of the most common ways presidents resist is in how they file that 48-hour report. They almost never state that they are filing the report pursuant to the War Powers Resolution. Instead, they consistently say the action is merely consistent with the resolution.
Okay, that sounds like legal hair splitting. For someone who's not an expert, what is the practical difference between pursuant to and consistent with? Why does that wording matter so much?
It's the entire battleground.
Yeah.
To report something pursuant to the WPR means the president is acknowledging the law is binding. It means he's activating the 60-day clock and accepting that Congress has the power to stop the operation.
Okay. And consistent with?
Reporting an action consistent with the WPR means the president is basically saying, I'm telling you about this as a courtesy, but I explicitly reject that the 60-day clock is mandatory. It's an assertion that the action is based on his own inherent Article 2 powers and that he views the WPR as advisory, not constitutionally binding.
So they also use definitional games, right? Arguing that certain actions just don't count as hostilities.
That's the other key evasion tactic. Look at Libya in 2011. President Obama initiated U.S. involvement in NATO air campaigns without seeking prior authorization. His administration argued that the operation, which was mostly airstrikes and support, didn't rise to the level of hostilities as defined by the WPR.
So the clock never even started.
The clock never started. Congress objected, but the action went ahead, setting yet another precedent that allows presidents to just define away their constraints.
We did see Congress try to use this mechanism recently and successfully pass a resolution only to hit that final wall. The veto.
Yes, the sources highlight the 2019 example. Congress passed a bipartisan resolution using the WPR Section 5C to end U.S. military support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. That was a huge institutional victory. It was the first time Congress had ever fully invoked the mechanism and passed a resolution to force the end of an ongoing conflict.
But the victory was short-lived.
It was. President Trump immediately vetoed it. And that example just perfectly crystallizes the dilemma of the WPR. Even when Congress musters the political will to assert its Article I powers, that two-thirds override requirement for a veto acts as an almost insurmountable firewall, protecting the executive's unilateral decision.
So the WPR is this unfinished experiment, a fragile agreement constantly being tested.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to SJRS 98, Venezuela, and the much larger looming flashpoint in the Arctic, Greenland. The fight over Venezuela is a scalpel, but the Greenland problem. That's a whole different kind of strategic crisis.
The jump from Venezuela to Greenland is so important because it really highlights the surgical limitations of the War Powers Resolution. SJRS 98 is incredibly specific.
Right. Venezuela is not Greenland. Let's make that absolutely crystal clear for everyone listening. The resolution for Venezuela is totally inadequate for the Greenland scenario.
Completely. The language of the resolution confines its authority. It only covers hostilities within or against Venezuela. If the president decides to act unilaterally against Greenland tomorrow, Congress would have to start this entire legislative process all over again.
A brand new resolution.
A brand new resolution. The WPR requires Congress to act separately, conflict by conflict. So any success on the Venezuela vote, it only creates a precedent of institutional resistance. It provides no practical guardrail against a future executive action in the Arctic or anywhere else.
So why has Greenland emerged as such a potent and, immediate strategic focus for the U.S. executive branch in 2026?
The current administration has consistently brought up the idea of acquiring Greenland, and it's driven by three major strategic motives, all tied to the new realities of the Arctic.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is just pure Arctic security, gaining consolidated control over a massive landmass that dominates the North Atlantic and the strategic GI-UK gap.
And the second is resources.
Access to immense mineral wealth, specifically rare earth elements, or REEs, which are absolutely vital for all advanced technology and defense systems.
And the third motivation, that relates to the military footprint we already have there.
Precisely. The U.S. already operates the vital Thule Air Base, which is now formally called Pacific Space Base, under a 1951 agreement with Denmark.
And that base is critical.
Absolutely critical. For missile warning, for space surveillance, radar coverage for the entire North American continent, and securing permanent, unambiguous control over the land where that base sits is seen by some executive strategists as a necessary consolidation.
Even if the current arrangement works perfectly fine.
Even then.
So let's apply the WPR framework to a hypothetical unilateral move on Greenland. What does that dangerous gray zone look like for Congress?
It looks like executive speed just completely overwhelming legislative deliberation. The president, relying on his expansive interpretation of Article 2, could launch a limited short-term operation, maybe a surprise deployment under the guise of force protection or securing U.S. assets, all without any prior congressional approval.
And the WPR only requires that 48-hour notification after the action has already started.
Correct. And military analysts, they all note that an operation against Greenland could be, from a purely military standpoint, swift and largely uncontested.
So it could be over before Congress even has time to really debate it.
It could. If the operation is successfully completed in just a few days, Congress might find itself staring at that 60-day clock with the mission already accomplished. The very nature of modern military velocity allows executive action to consistently get ahead of the slow, deliberate pace of the legislature.
But the sources also sound a really profound warning here. While the military operation might be swift, the political and legal consequences would be, catastrophic.
A diplomatic and strategic suicide mission. That's the consensus.
It's the ultimate tripping hazard.
It is. Because Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark.
A core founding member of NATO.
Right. Denmark is not a rival. It's not a hostile state. A U.S. military action to seize Greenland would mean using force against the sovereign territory of a NATO ally.
And the consensus among all the sources is that this wouldn't just strain the alliance. It would effectively destroy it.
The impacts would be immediate and terminal for NATO as a functioning body. The entire alliance is founded on Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all.
But what happens when the attacker is one?
If the United States, the architect and guarantor of NATO, attacks Denmark, it instantly renders Article 5 meaningless. A political fiction, as one source put it. The whole concept of mutual security just collapses when the security provider becomes the aggressor.
It seems like Congress thankfully recognizes this. They see the narrow scope of SJR-28, and they're already trying to get ahead of this potential Arctic catastrophe.
They are acting proactively. Lawmakers understand that a single war powers resolution isn't enough, so they're already exploring separate legislative avenues. For instance, Senator Ruben Gallego is reportedly planning a Greenland-specific war powers resolution.
And others are looking at the power of the purse.
Right, tying a prohibition of force to defense appropriations bills. Essentially, trying to starve any potential takeover plan of the money it would need to happen. The political noise coming from Capitol Hill suggests a real institutional awareness that they have to prevent a catastrophic presidential error in the Arctic.
That brings us to the hypothetical consequences. Let's really drill down into the strategic costs of a takeover, because the irony here is just devastating.
The irony is perhaps the most tragic part of this whole scenario. The fact is, the U.S. currently enjoys optimal strategic access in Greenland.
Through the existing agreements.
Right. Through the 1951 agreements and Pacific Space Base, the U.S. has everything it truly needs. Long-range radar, missile warning, intelligence sharing, surveillance access, All of this is secure without the political or military cost of actually owning the land.
So a takeover wouldn't enhance security at all. It would actively degrade it.
It would fundamentally manufacture a security problem. You'd be trading a peaceful, legitimate relationship with a NATO ally for a hostile, illegitimate occupation. And the sources are all unified that the #1 cost would be the collapse of NATO.
Okay, let's detail the practical effects of that. What does it actually look like when trust collapses inside the world's most successful military alliance?
Well, the functionality of the alliance relies completely on shared trust and integrated planning. If the U.S. attacks Denmark, that trust just vanishes overnight. Joint planning for everything from counterterrorism to conventional defense in Europe would instantly stall.
Allies would refuse to commit their forces.
Of course, they'd refuse to commit their forces to operations alongside the U.S. because they would fear being used or, frankly, betrayed.
And what about intelligence sharing? That's the lifeblood of the alliance.
Intelligence sharing would narrow drastically. Partners like Norway, the UK, Canada, they would severely limit the flow of sensitive data, especially about Russian movements or strategic planning. They couldn't trust that the U.S., having violated Denmark's sovereignty, wouldn't violate theirs or use that shared information coercively.
So NATO wouldn't formally dissolve, but it would just stop working?
It would become frozen, hollowed out by paralysis, unable to fulfill its core defensive mission.
The U.S. would gain an island, but lose the entire theater of operations. We would become strategically lonely in the Arctic.
That is the profound paradox. Right now, 7 of the 8 Arctic states are in NATO or are closely aligned with it, especially with Sweden and Finland now in the alliance.
And that geopolitical reality gives the U.S. unparalleled coalition dominance.
It does. Integrated logistics, shared domain awareness, coordinated patrols. If the U.S. fractures that alliance, it sacrifices all of that dominance.
And what happens when America tries to go it alone against Russia and China in the high north?
We suddenly become critically exposed. We would lose access to key infrastructure Norwegian ports, Canadian Arctic patrols. The U.S. icebreaker fleet is notably thin compared to Russia's, and our logistical infrastructure in the Arctic is underdeveloped. You'd be trading the powerful force multiplier of an alliance for solo exposure at the exact moment our rivals are consolidating their power.
It's a strategically illiterate exchange.
Completely.
And the damage would extend far beyond the Arctic. We would be handing a massive political and propaganda victory to our rivals.
An absolute gift. A unilateral seizure of Greenland is a profound violation of the UN Charter, which, by the way, the U.S. helped write and champions as the foundation of the post-war order.
It prohibits using force to alter borders.
The Charter explicitly prohibits using force to alter international borders or seize territory. By violating that bedrock principle, the U.S. would instantly shred its moral authority and its global credibility.
And what narrative does that gift allow Russia and China to push around the world?
It allows them to push the narrative that the West is fundamentally hypocritical. Russia could point to Greenland to justify its actions in Eastern Europe, arguing that might makes right is the real international principle, not law.
And China?
China could rationalize future aggression in the South China Sea or against Taiwan, claiming the U.S. sets the precedent that sovereignty only matters when it's convenient for the powerful. You'd be empowering your rivals by validating their core anti-Western position that international law is just a tool of powerful nations.
And finally, we have to factor in the complete and total rejection by the people who actually live there.
The local population is the ultimate check on this kind of imperial ambition. Polls show a near unanimous rejection. We're talking 82% to 92% of U.S. annexation or control.
And ignoring that would just confirm the narrative of neocolonialism.
Completely. The sources warn this would be an act of imperial short-termism, sacrificing legitimacy and long-term relationships for an immediate, unnecessary tactical gain.
So the constitutional conflict in Washington is trying to prevent this diplomatic and strategic catastrophe that looms over Greenland. Now, let's pivot and look at the geopolitical reality that makes the Arctic so strategically vital in 2026. And we have to start with Russia's aggressive fortification.
The Arctic is just not a peripheral frozen buffer zone anymore. It is now a primary theater of great power competition, and that's largely because of climate change. The accelerating melt is opening up sea lanes, it's exposing immense mineral wealth, and it's transformed the Arctic into a primary geopolitical fault line.
A fault line where military power has to be projected and sustained.
Exactly.
And Russia has a deep history here, going all the way back to the Soviet era. How does the current fortification drive under Putin compare to their Cold War posture?
During the Cold War, the Arctic was absolutely essential for Soviet nuclear deterrence. It hosted their vital submarine bastions, their intercontinental bomber routes. After 1991, a lot of that infrastructure just decayed.
But Putin changed that.
Under Vladimir Putin, since the mid-2000s, Russia launched this systematic national priority effort to remilitarize. They view the Arctic as indispensable to their national security and their energy wealth. And that effort escalated significantly after 2014, resulting in the reactivation and refurbishment of over 50 Soviet-era facilities along Russia's massive Arctic coastline.
And this military buildup is one of the few national priorities that didn't slow down, even with the immense resource drain from the war in Ukraine.
That's right. The focus just shifted from pure volume to consolidation and hardening of these bases.
What specific focused upgrades have we seen in the last few years from 2023 to 2026?
The sources emphasize key infrastructure upgrades that enable power projection. For example, the expansion of the Nogorskoye Air Base on Franz Josef Land.
Why is that one so important?
It now have a 3.5-kilometer runway that's capable of handling Russia's largest transport aircraft and their heavy strategic bombers like the Tu-95. This capability extends Russia's aerial reach deep into the high north.
And what about the Temp Air Base?
Temp Air Base on Kotelny Island also got extensive upgrades. This enhances logistics and, crucially, it integrates these remote bases into Russia's layered air and missile defense networks. This integrated network of sensors, coastal missile batteries, and advanced surface-to-air missile systems is designed to create an anti-accessoria denial bubble, an A2AD bubble, across the entire northern sea route.
Basically making it a no-go zone for NATO vessels and aircraft.
That's the goal. And Russia codified this deep commitment just recently in a revised strategic document.
The new Arctic strategy.
In October 2025, Putin unveiled a revised Arctic strategy that extends all the way to 2050. And it explicitly underscores the need for deep securitization. It confirms that no matter what happens elsewhere, the Arctic is a core strategic asset for them.
At the very heart of Russia's asymmetric advantage in the Arctic is its northern fleet. Let's detail the composition and capability there because it's something NATO really struggles to match.
The Northern Fleet, which is headquartered in Murmansk, is their main military force. It is formidable. It's got over 30 submarines, many of which are nuclear-powered and carry ballistic or cruise missiles. This is what secures Russia's critical second-strike nuclear capability. They also have over 30 surface combatants.
But the truly unique advantage, the thing that makes Russia the dominant physical power, is its icebreaker fleet.
That is the decisive asymmetric edge. Russia has the world's largest and most technologically advanced icebreaker fleet, including 7 colossal nuclear-powered vessels. This allows them to operate year-round.
And crucially, many of them are dual use.
That's the key. They're built to support military logistics, and in some cases, they've been modified to launch conventional long-range weapons, like caliber cruise missiles. This means a civilian-looking vessel can actually be an integrated missile launch platform, which vastly complicates targeting and strategic calculations for any rival.
They're also investing heavily in the silent war under the ice.
Indeed. On the seabed, Russia is deploying what they call the Harmony Underwater Surveillance System. It's a network of hydroacoustic sensors designed specifically to track NATO submarines and other naval assets trying to approach their submarine bastions in the Barents Sea.
Creating a defensive moat.
Exactly. Protecting their most survivable nuclear assets and reinforcing their perceived control of the domain.
And beyond just hardware, Russia is using military exercises for some very potent strategic signaling. We've seen a sharp increase in frequency and ambition.
The frequency of exercises has doubled since 2020. And these operations often involve highly provocative maneuvers, long-range cruise missile launches, complex amphibious landings. A huge milestone happened in September 2024.
Oh, it's that.
Russia conducted its largest naval exercises in decades, and notably, they involved Chinese forces for the very first time in waters adjacent to the Arctic. That joint exercise signals a geopolitical alignment that the West simply cannot ignore.
And more recently, their focus has shifted to contesting the critical maritime choke points in the North Atlantic.
The latest round of exercises that followed Zapad 2025 saw Russia closing off large sections of the Barents Sea. These drills were focused specifically on rehearsing long-range strike capabilities designed to contest the GIUK gap.
Okay, for our listeners quickly, what is the GIUK gap and why is contesting it such a strategic priority for Russia?
The GIUK gap is the critical maritime corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. Historically, during the Cold War, this was the primary barrier NATO used to stop Soviet submarines and fleets from getting into the North Atlantic shipping lanes.
And if Russia can contest that gap.
If Russia can project power there, as these rehearsals suggest they're trying to do, it gives them enormous leverage. It means Russia can threaten transatlantic shipping, potentially cut off NATO's ability to reinforce Europe in a crisis, and just generally disrupt the flow of supplies and troops from North America.
So while Moscow claims its fortification is defensive, protecting its nuclear deterrent and its energy infrastructure, the reality is that the posture allows for significant offensive pressure.
The defensive logic is certainly part of it, but the capability clearly goes beyond just defense. From these hardened year-round Arctic bases, Russia can project conventional power, threaten crucial logistics, conduct hybrid warfare against its neighbors like Norway and Finland, and exert coercive pressure. With NATO's expansion to include Finland and Sweden, the Arctic has cemented its status, in Moscow's eyes, as a crucial high-stakes front line.
That sets the stage perfectly for Russia's increasingly vital partner in this sphere. China. Let's look at the Polar Silk Road.
The involvement of China, a non-Arctic state, just fundamentally complicates the whole strategic picture. Right. Beijing had to, they had to create a new diplomatic category to justify their presence there at all.
And that category is the deliberately ambiguous term, the near-Arctic state. Where did that come from?
It was formalized in China's 2018 Arctic Policy White Paper. China has no Arctic coastline, no territorial claim. So the term near-Arctic state is a very calculated piece of diplomatic signaling. It asserts that China's immense geopolitical and economic interests, trade, climate, resources, grant it an essential non-negotiable voice and influence in the region, regardless of geography.
It's a claim to influence, not territory.
Exactly.
So what are the main strategic drivers that are pulling China into this frozen theater? It's clearly more than just academic interests.
The drivers are existential for China's long-term economic and national security. The first and most compelling is the economic advantage of shorter trade routes.
The Northern Sea Route?
The Northern Sea Route, or NSR, that runs along Russia's coast. It can cut shipping distances between Asia and Europe by a staggering 30 to 40% compared to the traditional route through the Suez Canal. That translates into billions in savings and faster delivery.
And this directly addresses a persistent strategic vulnerability that China faces globally.
Yes, the long-standing Malacca dilemma. China is acutely aware that a huge majority of its energy and commodity imports, up to 80% of its oil, has to pass through the narrow Strait of Malacca.
A maritime choke point heavily patrolled and potentially controlled by U.S.-aligned forces in a conflict.
Precisely. So the Polar Silk Road is a strategic bypass. It insulates China from that vulnerability. Third, it ensures energy security. China is heavily invested in securing diversified, long-term supplies of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, from Arctic projects like Yamal and Arctic LNG 2. This insulates their economy from instability in the Middle East.
And finally, the race for critical minerals, which ties directly back to Greenland.
Resource access is paramount. Beneath the thinning Arctic ice are massive reserves of critical minerals, most importantly, rare earth elements, which are foundational for almost all high-tech and defense industries. Securing access solidifies their dominance in the global REE supply chain.
So let's look at how the Polar Silk Road is physically being built. This is an infrastructure project that's integrated deeply into China's national planning.
It is. The PSR is integrated into their 14th five-year plan, which shows its foundational importance to their long-term vision. The backbone is the NSR infrastructure. China is heavily expanding its own icebreaker fleet with its new Yulong vessels, and critically, sources indicate they are now starting construction on their own domestic nuclear-powered icebreakers.
Which signals an intention to operate year-round on their own.
Independent of Russian aid, yes. And their investment in Russian energy projects is massive. It locks them into a long-term supply relationship.
Tell me about that investment.
Chinese state-owned giants like the China National Petroleum Corporation hold a significant 20% stake in the Yamal LNG project, and they've committed billions more to the ambitious Arctic LNG 2 project. The analysis describes this Arctic LNG not just as a commodity, but as China's strategic reserve on ice.
Providing long-term, politically insulated energy stability.
Exactly. And beyond physical goods and gas, the PSR also has a huge digital ambition.
What does that look like?
The ambition is to extend their digital Silk Road through submarine communication cables and Arctic data corridors connecting Asia and Europe. The key example was the Arctic Connect project, a high-speed fiber optic cable through the high north.
But that faced significant resistance.
It did. Nordic states, including Finland and Norway, halted the project due to security risks. They viewed the digital infrastructure as a potential vehicle for surveillance and strategic information control. The Arctic is not just a trade zone, it's a data battleground.
And this brings us right back to Greenland, the ultimate fulcrum in this resource competition.
Greenland is the grand prize. It directly intersects China's strategic ambition and Western security concerns. The island holds an estimated 18% of the world's rare earth element supply.
And why is that specific reserve so critical in the context of China's current position?
Because China already controls approximately 80% of global REE processing capacity. Securing the Greenland reserve would tighten their near monopoly on the entire supply chain, from mining the raw material to refining the final product. And this threat has triggered an aggressive pushback from the West.
The U.S. and Denmark have been blocking bids.
They've jointly intervened to block Chinese firms from acquiring strategic assets, like mines and airport stakes, deeming these bids to be strategic threats, not just commercial transactions.
So China is working to create its own corridor, bypass Western choke points, and secure the very materials the West needs. And that drives this consolidation of power between Beijing and Moscow.
The acceleration of the Sino-Russian alignment after 2022 was, well, it was really an act of necessity. Russia, facing crippling Western sanctions and global isolation after the invasion of Ukraine, desperately needed two things:
Capital and technology.
capital and technology, and a massive, reliable market for its energy. China provided both. It filled the financial and technological void left by the West.
And Russian energy exports to China just surged, right? That's the foundation of this economic alignment.
They surged by nearly 50% in the immediate aftermath of the sanctions. This interdependence forms the economic bedrock of their Arctic partnership. Russia gets a crucial revenue stream, and China gets energy stability.
So let's detail how this partnership has been formalized between 2024 and 2026. They've been institutionalizing this cooperation across logistics and governance.
The institutionalization is deep and structural. In May 2024, they established the China-Russia Arctic Shipping Lanes Cooperation Subcommittee. Now, this is a profound development.
Why so profound?
Because it grants China, a non-Arctic state, a direct official voice in navigation decisions along Russia's sovereign northern sea road. Moscow made a huge strategic concession there to secure Chinese investment.
And this cooperation extends to ensuring the NSR is operational year-round.
Absolutely. By June 2024, agreements with Rosatom, that's Russia's state nuclear energy corporation, were secured to enable year-round operation of the NSR with an ambitious target of hitting 50 million tons of annual cargo traffic by 2030.
That's a massive number.
It's huge, and that level of operation requires continuous, integrated logistical planning.
And the October 2025 pact, that seems to be the master blueprint for this logistical fusion.
It is. It's the most comprehensive agreement to date, a pact to jointly develop and commercialize the NSR. This covers everything: shipbuilding, port maintenance, logistics systems, communications infrastructure. It's about building a shared, reliable logistical artery.
And they even institutionalized training.
In November 2025, a memorandum on Arctic maritime training. Chinese sailors are studying polar navigation at Russian universities, investing in this future shared expertise and control over the route.
This convergence has also become a direct challenge to the Western sanctions regime, hasn't it? Especially on energy assets.
It's a direct financial and geopolitical challenge. The sources all note China's acceptance of sanctioned Arctic LNG-2 cargoes in 2025. By providing a guaranteed market for these huge sanctioned projects, Beijing is signaling its willingness to directly subvert Western enforcement, all while securing its own long-term energy supplies.
It sounds like an unstoppable force, but you mentioned structural limitations. Is this a true fusion, or is it more of a pragmatic relationship?
It is definitively a marriage of convenience, and it's defined by competing long-term strategic visions. The two nations have fundamentally different goals in the Arctic.
How so?
Russia views the Arctic primarily as a core sovereign military zone, a protective moat around its nuclear assets, and it prefers tight national control over the NSR. China, on the other hand, is motivated by economic access and trade routes. It would prefer a future where the Arctic is governed as an international commons, not a Russian sovereign space.
So their partnership is transactional, not ideological.
Precisely. It's heavy on logistics, capital, and energy, but it's relatively light on deep military interoperability or political fusion outside of their shared anti-Western sentiment. It is a pragmatic alliance designed to counter Western pressure and maximize mutual economic gain.
So what is the strategic outcome of this pragmatic alliance in the Arctic?
The outcome is the emergence of a clear, powerful, de facto NSR duopoly. Russia and China are positioning themselves as the joint gatekeepers of the Northern Sea Route. They are collectively challenging the established idea of the Arctic as a neutral global commons open to all, and they are redefining energy security and maritime governance in their favor.
Which forces NATO and the West to dedicate massive resources to counter this new power geometry in the high north.
It does.
This entire exploration of geopolitical power games brings us almost full circle right back to Greenland, where all this great power ambition meets the lives of 57,000 people. We have to now focus on the indigenous voices, the Kalalit people, who are struggling to determine their own destiny amidst these colossal forces.
This is the essential human dimension that just so often disappears in these discussions of strategy and resources. Greenland is home to 57,000 people, and nearly 90% of them are Inuit or Kalalit. Their history is one of centuries of external control.
First Norse, then Danish assimilation.
Right, and often very painful experiences with foreign military presence, most notably the devastating 1968 Thule Air Base nuclear accident, which instilled this deep, deep mistrust of foreign powers, particularly the U.S.
But they have been steadily moving towards self-determination. What are the milestones that mark their path toward potential full independence?
The movement toward decolonization is really defined by political progress. You had the 1979 Home Rule Act and then the 2009 Self-Government Act, which transferred control over internal affairs from Denmark to the local government.
And that had huge popular support.
Massive. The 2008 referendum showed 75.5% of the population endorsed increased self-rule. So today, while Denmark still handles foreign affairs and defense, the Greenland government manages its own resources.
Independence seems inevitable, but it really hinges on one crucial financial element.
It hinges entirely on securing a viable, sustainable revenue source to replace the crucial $600 million annual subsidy provided by Denmark. That financial necessity is the primary barrier to declaring full independence. Without a stable, large-scale source of revenue, independence risks immediate economic collapse.
And this economic necessity clashes directly with the president's desire for annexation and the overwhelming opposition from the Greenlandic people.
That opposition is fierce, and it's driven by a strong, unified sense of sovereignty. The Prime Minister, Muta Ejide, his words are the mandate. We don't want to be Danish, we don't want to be American, we want to be Greenlandic.
And the polls back that up.
The polls showing 82 to 92% opposition to U.S. control are a clear rejection of any neo-colonial influence. They are not interested in trading one foreign power for another, no matter what the perceived benefits are.
So if they reject annexation, what kind of relationship are they actually seeking with the West?
They're seeking true partnerships, ones built on respect for their sovereignty. Inuit leaders have expressed interest in models like a compact of free association, similar to the agreements the U.S. has with some Pacific nations.
And under that kind of model,
Greenland would retain full sovereignty and self-governance while possibly agreeing to security cooperation or resource sharing. It ensures that foreign interests support, rather than override, indigenous priorities. They want partners, not patrons.
we've talked about climate change as this big geopolitical catalyst, but for the Kalalit people, it's an immediate existential crisis.
It is the defining feature of their daily lives. Greenland is warming 4 times faster than the global average. This isn't some abstract policy number, it's a physical reality that's accelerating. Ice sheet melts, and it's fundamentally altering the traditional hunting and fishing patterns that sustain their communities and underpin their entire culture.
And indigenous advocates frame this climate crisis in political terms.
They do. They view it as a continuation of colonial pressures. The consequences of global industrial emissions, mostly generated by developed nations, are disproportionately threatening the traditional existence and cultural survival of the Kalalit. They are being forced to adapt or perish, and their advocates are demanding global accountability.
This environmental reality leads directly into Greenland's great dilemma: the immense lure of economic prosperity from resource extraction versus the massive environmental and cultural risks.
It is a profound, life-altering choice. The lure is that estimated 18% of global REEs and other minerals. Mining offers the only immediate large-scale path to achieving the revenue they need for full independence.
But the costs are severe.
The costs are severe. The risk of environmental degradation, irreversible damage to fragile ecosystems, cultural erosion.
Are there specific projects that really exemplify this tension?
The controversy over the Kvanefjeld rare earth and uranium mine is the perfect example. Kvanefjeld is one of the world's largest RE deposits, But its extraction would involve massive pollution risks because the rare earths are co-located with radioactive uranium.
And this became a huge political battleground.
It did. It led to a snap election and a ban on uranium mining in 2021, which shows the deep internal division over whether that economic gain is worth the potential environmental poison. The conflict shows that the decision to mine is intrinsically linked to the cultural survival of the Kalaalleq people.
So what conditions are Inuit leaders demanding for any foreign investment or resource project to proceed today?
They are demanding absolute control and agency. Inuit leaders universally demand veto power over specific projects, the implementation of uncompromisingly high environmental standards, and partnership agreements that guarantee foreign economic interests don't undermine Indigenous cultural preservation or environmental protection.
They want to make sure that if the resources are extracted, the wealth stays in Greenland and the decisions remain Greenlandic. This has been an incredibly expansive exploration of all these converging crises. We've gone from a very specific procedural fight in the U.S. Senate all the way to the strategic geometry of the Arctic, and then concluded with the deep cultural crisis facing the people of Greenland.
What's so fascinating is how the melting ice has acted as this catalyst. It's simultaneously exposed the structural flaws in our global alliances and the constitutional tension inside the U.S. We really identified three intersecting conflicts operating in parallel.
What's the first?
First, the constitutional conflict. It's exemplified by S. Jerry's Point 98, and it pits executive agility against legislative restraint in matters of war.
And the second is the geopolitical conflict in the Arctic, where potential U.S. unilateralism on Greenland risks destroying NATO, while at the same time our rivals are consolidating power into this Sino-Russian NSR duopoly.
A duopoly challenging the very definition of the global commons. And finally, the human conflict in Greenland itself. The struggle where resource-driven economic necessity, the very thing that promises independence, clashes head-on with the urgent threat of climate change and the imperative of cultural and environmental sovereignty.
And an error in one of those conflicts, say a unilateral move on Greenland, would immediately trigger failure across the other two,
leading to strategic isolation and a global loss of credibility, instantly.
So the Senate's vote on Venezuela is really an institutional attempt to reinsert that necessary friction into a system that has just become too smooth, too streamlined for its own good. The framers intentionally made decisions of war hard. They wanted it to require collective judgment.
And the Arctic is the testing ground for whether that mechanism can still function. The ultimate tension we've identified is this clash between the executive's ability to act at digital speed and Congress's need to deliberate at a legislative pace. In a world defined by the velocity of global crisis and climate urgency, that deliberative process seems to always be lagging behind.
That is the perfect summary. And it leads us to our final provocative thought for you to explore on your own. If the constitutional guardrails, like the 60-day clock and the requirement for consultation, if they were designed for a slow-moving 19th century world of deliberation, what specific structural mechanisms could genuinely make starting a war hard in the 21st century? How do you guarantee institutional restraint when the pace of technology and executive action is constantly accelerating? Something for you to mull or explore on your own.